Good afternoon and welcome to our program today, Trauma-Informed Librarianship Part 1, Essentials for Library Users with Lauren Jackson. And we're so glad that you're able to join us. We hope that you're able to join us for Part 2 next Monday, June 12th. And that is Trauma-Informed Librarianship Part 2, Essentials for Library Workers. So before we begin, I do have a few items to share. First, I'm Christine Brown, Outreach Services Librarian at the South Central Regional Library Council. I use pronouns she, her. SCRLC is one of 9 multi-library systems comprising the Empire State Library Network in New York State, and we cover 14 counties. A total of 10,045 square miles. We're headquartered in Ithaca in Tompkins County. And our offices occupy the unceded traditional homelands of the Gayacahono people, one of the 6 nations of the Great Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We invite you to consider the history of your land wherever you are. We will post a link to Native Land Digital to identify original indigenous territories in the U.S., Canada, and around the world. We also recognize that colonialism and oppression continue to create trauma for Indigenous people today. Those of us who are not Indigenous can center and support Indigenous nations, organizations, and grassroots change movements through time, energy, or financial contributions. For example, you can make a contribution to the American Indian Library Association, and we'll be sharing a link for that as well. And in Tompkins County, the local Standing Up for Racial Justice has an initiative for people to make regular contributions that for right now go to the Gayacahono Nation, the Multicultural Resource Center, the Southside Community Center, Black Lives Matter Ithaca, and the Alliance of Families for Justice. They are looking to add more as well. And if you want additional information, you can direct message me. A few other items. If you have not found it already, closed captioning is at the bottom. And you can click on show caption in your taskbar. Throughout the presentation, you're welcome to type questions and comments via the chat feature. If you would like everyone to see your questions and comments, make sure to select everyone, or else it's just going to go to the person selected. And the webinar today is being recorded, and it will be shared with all registrants along with information about how to request a certificate of attendance. And there will be a link to the evaluation form at the end. We also ask that you follow SCRLC's Code of Conduct, and we'll be putting a link in the chat as well. Basically, that is be kind, be courteous, be respectful, and we also hope that you'll be totally engaged. And now I'm going to introduce Lauren. Lauren Jackson is originally from New York and currently lives in Charleston, South Carolina. She works as the executive director of Region 2 Regional Medical Library located at the Medical University of South Carolina. Before becoming an academic librarian, Lauren worked with underserved youth in the nonprofit and education sectors for a decade. Lauren's primary research interests include trauma-informed and critical librarianship. In their spare time, Lauren enjoys reading, podcasts, interior design, and journaling. Okay, and Lauren, you can take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm very glad to see that you're here. We're going to get started with a fun activity, which is for you to share which raccoon you are today. So we have 9 choices. And if you could just put it in the chat, it will help me get a feel for how we're feeling in the room today. For me, I'd probably say number 2, maybe because of the glasses. I'm going to go with number 2, but I'm happy to see what other things. Okay, we have a 1, 6, a strong 5. Oh my, okay. Honesty, 4, 8, 3, number 1 due to internet issues. I'm sorry, Jenny. 7, 6, 3. 3 is a good one. Number 9, lots of number 9s. Okay. I feel like that's ready to learn, eager, looking for what's coming. Okay, great. So thank you so much. And I know there's raccoons in upstate New York too. So there's that part too. So thank you so much for sharing. And I'll talk a little bit about why it's important to check in with people as a trauma-informed approach later in the presentation. All right, so now that we've checked in, the next thing we're going to do is an invitation to do a breathing exercise. If it makes you uncomfortable, you do not have to do it. All we're going to do is 2 or 3 inhales for a 5 count. So you're going to inhale for 5 and then exhale for 5. All right. All right. So thank you for partaking in that with me if you decided to. If you didn't, that's totally okay. I wanted to include this breathing exercise as a reminder that you can always return to your breath. Anytime you're at work, anytime throughout this workshop, anytime in your life, it's there for you and can be used as an anchor. So hopefully that was helpful for you if you wanted to recenter like me. I'm a little nervous, so the breathing was helpful for me. All right. So our agenda for today, part 1 is I'm going to tell you a bit more about me. I'll go over some housekeeping for the rest of the presentation. We'll work together through some group agreements for this session today. I'll tell you about the objectives for the presentation, and then we'll move into defining trauma. Then we'll have a short break. After that, the second part of the presentation will be a presentation of trauma-informed strategies and resources for you. You'll have time to have some takeaways and share those with the group, and then we'll close. Throughout the presentation, after the objectives, it will become a lot more interactive. So there will be a couple breakout sessions for you to talk to each other about what you're thinking about and what you're learning from the content today, and also to reflect a bit about what you can take with you after our session ends. All right, so the next part is about me. So you know who's working with you today. So I was originally born in Brooklyn in New York City, but I was raised in upstate New York, in Endwell to be exact. And this picture in the middle is me, and then on either side of me is my younger brother and sister who are twins. Their names are Brenda and Brian. And I believe this was the blizzard of '97, I want to say, is the picture outside, if you remember that. And this was outside of our house, so we were definitely having fun in the snow. And so New York, in upstate New York, is very near and dear to my heart, and I just wanted to share that little bit about me, even though I live in Charleston now. So other things about me, like Christine said, and thank you, Christine, for that introduction. I'm the executive director for the Region Medical Library in Region 2, which is in the southeastern United States, right, like in Charleston, and we serve 6 states and 2 territories through the network of the National Library of Medicine. I explained where my hometown is. I'm also one of the co-founders of WOC and LIB, which is a blog space online, particularly for people of color to share about their experiences with working in galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. I'm very proud of that project, and it's still running. So I wanted to share that bit of background. As Christine said, those are some of my research interests there: critical librarianship and trauma-informed librarianship. I love talking about it, and I'm happy to be here with you today to talk about it. And then, of course, some of my interests. The next slide has to do more with my positionality. So I identify as Black, a member of the LGBTQIA community, and also as someone who's disabled. Those are some things that can sometimes or often count against me in different situations in ways that I'm oppressed. But I also have privilege too, in terms of my positionality. So I'm married to, a cisgender man. I am a godparent. I have lots of education and class privilege due to my educational background and being a librarian. And I have English language privilege. So by speaking English and having that be, my native tongue, I have a lot of privilege in that way compared to people who have English not as a first language. So it's important, I think, to share that there are ways that we have privilege in the spaces that we occupy in society, as well as ways that we are all oppressed. It's a mixture of both, and I'll talk a bit more about intersectionality later in this presentation, but that's who is presenting to you today, more about me. All right, housekeeping. You're invited to keep your videos on. Thank you, Caroline and Christine, if you want, and your mic's muted, which all of you are doing, which I appreciate, unless you're sharing, but you don't have to. You can keep your video off if you need to, but you are invited to turn your videos on. If you have a question, please use the raise hand function if you're able to. And also you can always write in the chat, as Christine said, as we go through the presentation, if you have questions or comments. In addition to this meeting being recorded, the slides will be shared out following the presentation as well. So you'll have those as well to reference. All right, so the next section of our presentation today are group agreements. So this is a chance for all of you to contribute. I'm gonna stop sharing for just a moment. And in the chat, we're gonna put the link to the Padlet where you can contribute in addition to some additional, thank you so much, in addition to some of the other group agreements that I pre-planned. So I'm gonna share my screen so that you can see it, but you'll also be able to contribute. So here are some of the group agreements I came up with before. We're going to try to use I statements when sharing thoughts, comments, and opinions. We want to recognize that intent is not the same as impact as we work together. Another note is that nothing in this session will put you in physical harm or danger. But I also want us, I'm going to jump ahead. We want to also be aware that talking about race and gender and these issues is bound to trigger negative, competitive, bewildering, defensive emotions. So that's normal and to be expected, but you won't actually be in physical harm or danger. We want to respect others' experiences as they share. I would like for all of us to agree to remain engaged through the session and participate in some way. And when anything happens that is uncomfortable or troubling, please remember that you can return to your breath like we did at the beginning of today's session. All right, so if those sound good to everyone, if you can give me a thumbs up or say yes in the chat, then I'll know that we're all on the same page. Great, awesome. And if you have anything to add, great, amen, yes, okay, great. Thank you so much. If you have anything to add, please go ahead and put it in the Padlet. It's meant to be interactive. So if something comes up while we're meeting, go ahead and I'll keep it open so that we can return to it as we need. Great, I'm seeing this. So this is another, just as a quick aside, this is another important trauma-informed strategy, which has to do with consent. So it's making sure that the people that are participating with you or that you're working with agree to certain standards or protocol, just like the code of conduct that Christine shared. This is a trauma-informed approach, is to make sure that people are on board with you and that they're willing to follow the same thing. Right from there, you can already establish a relationship of trust because you know that you're not just imposing these values on someone, but you may have put them out there, but you know that they agree to follow the same thing. So quick aside, but that is an important thing to also remember. Thank you all for contributing to that. So let me go back to making sure my screen is shared. Gonna switch real quick. Okay, great. All right, so our objectives for today are that I'm gonna work to define trauma. We're gonna talk about how to have a trauma-informed approach in public library spaces with working with library users. We're going to discuss some micro strategies that you can use and talk about how you can begin to develop your own style of being trauma-informed as you work with different users of the library. All right, so we have another interactive moment here, which is to learn more from you. So what do you hope to get out of this session? There's going to be a survey link dropped into the chat, thank you, for Mentimeter. So if you could just fill this out, I'm going to give you a few quiet minutes to tell me what you hope to get out of this session. All right, wonderful. Thank you for contributing. If you haven't yet, it's okay. You can keep typing out your thoughts. But here are some of the things that I've seen so far. Strategies for shaping continuing education and outreach at my library. Walking in thinking I don't know what I don't know. Sure, that's a fine place to start. We'll talk about some of those ideas and thinking about how to shape this, how to even think about being trauma informed. Practical, usable resources, excellent. Learning about what this type of librarianship, trauma-informed librarianship is. Strategies to diffuse potential arguments. Yeah, definitely. So some conflict management. Be better informed and have more tools to deal with trauma that patrons might experience while using the library and just in general as well. Great. Recognizing signs of patrons and being able to help them. Strategies to reduce unintentional harm when working with people. I'm a new teen librarian and I want to learn how to make my teen space feel safe and inclusive while also providing meaningful and helpful services. Wonderful. Learn more about making the library a safe space for the staff and patrons, a set of tools and better ways than already using of coping with trauma. Is it different from basic compassion and kindness? Sure. How to work with patrons who have trauma without adding to their trauma. More compassionate responses to patron needs, systemic recommendations. Yeah. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot about tools, empathy, handling sensitive topics, unhoused population. Okay, wow, great. These are really wonderful, and I hope we can keep them in mind as we go through the presentation. And if you see ways, to really relate what we're talking about here to these different questions, these wonderful questions that you brought today, please help us, bring it back to that as we work together, and say how you think it might answer those questions. And I'll definitely keep them in mind too as we go. All right, great. So let me move back to the slideshow here. Just gotta move my screens around for one moment. All right, so thank you so much for sharing what you hope to get out of the session. The next thing that we're going to work on is actually defining what trauma is, because I'm sure for everyone, trauma can be kind of a buzzword, and it is in our trauma or in our culture right now. So we want to start with another Mentimeter survey about how each of you define trauma. So we're going to drop another link into the chat, and I have to, let's see, move us to the next slide. Okay. So now we should be on how do you define trauma? So again, a couple minutes to put in how you would describe it. How would you, explain what trauma is to a colleague, to a library patron? What is the term that you use in general? Anything like that? Great. It seems like a lot of you already know a lot about how to define trauma. So we have an impactful event that causes harm or distress, an experience that can lead to negative repercussions in someone's life, damaging experiences that last in your memory and affect interactions with others, confronted with an unexpected situation where there is confrontation from others, a physical or invisible injury or event that is distressing, maybe produces PTSD and can be life-altering in some way. And let's see, I'll choose a couple more. Disruptive, chaotic event that is larger than one's coping skills. Lack of control, power, agency can be big or small. Impacts time and memory, self-care functioning. A negative event or series of experiences that affects your ongoing sense of self and view of the world. Wonderful. Yeah, these are great. Definitely all part of it. I'll tell you more about what I've learned about how to define trauma, but these are very much in line with what I think you're about to hear from me. All right, so let me share my other screen. Of course, you can continue to contribute to that as you wish. if you have other things that you'd like to share there for your definition. Okay, so as we get into defining more about what trauma is, this has been a landmark text for me. If you have not seen it, it's called My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies from Resmaa Menakem. And I have a few excerpts from the beginning of the book that I think are very helpful in terms of understanding how to define trauma. So I'm going to share those with you now. So this is one. The body is where we live. It's where we fear, hope, and react. It's where we constrict and relax. And what the body most cares about are safety and survival. When something happens to the body that is too much, too fast, or too soon, it overwhelms the body and can create trauma. So we're really talking about a physical experience, right? It's very much in our bodies when we experience trauma that happens that is too much, too soon. It's overwhelming. As someone said, it's chaotic, and it makes us have a response that is immediately trying to get back to normal. Right? It's not something that is logical. It's not something that is processed intellectually. It's an immediate response by our body in an effort to try to keep us safe when something happens. Here's another quote from Menakem. Contrary to what many people believe, trauma is not an emotional response. Trauma always happens in the body. It is a spontaneous protective mechanism used by the body to stop or thwart further or future potential damage. So it really does live in the body. And some key words here I think are spontaneous, protective mechanism, right? It's an immediate response, and it's really coming from the body initially, which is why a lot of times the ways that we react, you can visually see that somebody's experiencing a traumatic event because it's physical. So another quote, well, other ideas from Menakem with defining trauma are that it is essentially a tool of safety and survival. It's the body's protective response to an event or series of events it perceives as potentially dangerous. I'm going to say that again. So it is the body's protective response to an event or series of events it perceives as potentially dangerous. So again, some key words: protection, response, perception or perceived, potential, and danger. So that's what we're really talking about here, right? And I think another thing that is so important to understand about perception is that the way that we perceive can be accurate, it can be inaccurate, it can be entirely imaginary, and it doesn't make a difference. It's how we perceive something that's happening that has an impact on how we react. So a lot of times, like fear that happens when someone feels like it's a perceived threat, that's enough to cause a traumatic response in that person's body because they're afraid of what they see. So I thought that was an important distinction to make. Other information from Menakem: the response happens instantaneously, and it is usually fight, flee, freeze, or fawn. So I just want to define what each of those means, because not everyone knows, like they've probably heard those terms, but you don't always know what it means. So your nervous system, right, regulates your body's processes with breathing, heart rate, right, sweating, and it subconsciously keeps you ticking. It's always going on in the background. When your nervous system is overwhelmed by a trigger, the sympathetic nervous system, which is like a subdivision of the nervous system, kicks into action, and it has an autonomic response that will take charge and controls your body's physical responses. So in these moments of trauma, if you fight, the fight response is a trauma response of self-preservation. So in order to protect yourself, you act aggressively towards the threat because you really think that you're in danger and that they're going to hurt you. So of course, like your stress levels, like your cortisol and your adrenaline levels rise, and it makes it harder for you to think clearly and react calmly. Your anger is expressed through trying to dominate the situation or pursue power. With flight, this response is a trauma response controlled by panicked or avoidant behavior. It pushes you to isolate yourself from the perceived threat. When triggered, it can be hard to sit still, to stay in a room, or even to talk to other people. Ways that you can see this are normally like restlessness, darting eyes, like people looking all over in different directions, or when their extremities shake, like hands and legs. And this physical reaction of trauma, especially if it's sustained over a period of time, can trigger chronic pain, actually, if you constantly live in this state. Freeze. The freeze response is a trauma response that relies on dissociation to detach from the perceived threat. So when the flight response, becomes overwhelmed by anxiety or by stress, it tries to reject it by numbing emotions and withdrawing from reality. This is often described as seeing someone who looks like they're a deer in headlights. Some also compare this to an animal that like fakes being dead when it's being stalked by a predator. That's kind of, freezing. And in their movement, so you feel immobile, unable to move or look away, like you're just frozen. Your heart rate builds and your breathing quickens, and you usually dissociate from your body or its physical reactions. And the last one with fawn. So the fawn response is a trauma response that relies on people pleasing in order to avoid conflict. So you're trying to placate a perceived threat and like talk them down, right? Trying to calm them down so that they don't hurt you or hurt someone else even more. This trauma response prioritizes the threat and tends to its needs, similar to like a codependent relationship, like where one person is giving more than another. So this person will try to smile, but they might be like really tense actually on the inside and no longer acting in their best interest. And the tunnel vision of someone who is fawning is really about trying to eliminate or like minimize the threat with flattery and self-denial. So like you're not thinking about yourself, you're only thinking about the other person so that they're not as dangerous. So this is something to think about, right? So when you have people from the community entering into your library space, if they enter into one of these, but they're having a response to something that's happened to them, a crisis from outside of the library, and then they come in, you might see these responses because they think that they're experiencing, well, they know that they're feeling a traumatic moment happening. So you might see someone who is frozen in time or is having difficulty moving. You might see someone trying to talk someone else down in the lobby or as they're entering into the library. You might see someone really tensing up and getting really angry about something that doesn't make sense for why they might be angry. And that's because they might have just experienced a traumatic moment outside of the library or earlier that day. So this is something to think about. And now you can kind of see that there are some clues that you can look out for how others might feel, and not just the library users, but also fellow coworkers, right? Like if somebody's experiencing something, now you can kind of recognize and know that those flags might be happening when they experience a traumatic event. So we have one more quote from Menachem. From the body's viewpoint, safety and danger are neither situational nor based on cognitive feelings. Rather, they are physical, visceral sensations. The body either has a sense of safety or it doesn't. If it doesn't, it will do almost anything to establish or recover that same sense of safety. So again, if someone had a really rough day, someone mentioned that there might be a large unhoused population, right? Maybe they were denied a benefit that they really needed earlier in the day. They come in yelling and, very upset, or get upset when there's a book or a computer is not available or something. It's important for us to remember that they're just trying to establish a sense of safety. They felt like earlier in that day, their sense of safety was taken away from them. So when they enter the library, they might be in a higher agitated state because of what happened. So it helps kind of provide some context for some of the behavior that you might see. And then it becomes a little more depersonalized, right? Then it's not about you or the library space or the worker, but rather what that person has gone through. And I'll get more into that a little bit later, but that's really the main thing that I wanted to drive home, is that they're really just trying to get back to safety and trying to protect themselves after someone who has experienced a crisis event enters into another space. Okay, so what does it mean to be trauma-informed? Being trauma-informed is approaching situations in a way that acknowledges the invisible or visible injuries that impact the way that we engage with the world. So to some degree, everyone has experienced some type of trauma. And any injuries that were left by that, whether they be physical, visible or invisible underneath, impact the ways that we interact with others in the world. Of course, some injuries we can see, sometimes with the ways that people enter into a room, look around a space, how they carry their bodies, and a lot we cannot see. An important thing to remember here, right, is that usually only 7% of our communication is verbal. The rest is nonverbal in terms of physical communication. So body language and voice is how human beings interpret a lot of communication when people are talking to them. So that's important to keep in mind. So much of the information that we're getting about how people feel and how they're communicating with us is not actually by what they say, but how they say it. We want to understand the importance of maximizing safety for all people. So again, everyone is craving returning to being regulated or, homeostasis, like everyone's trying to get back to being safe. And that's basically one of our prime objectives that is actually not intellectual. It's really just our bodies need to return to safety all the time. So we want to think holistically about the ways that we interact with others and respond in ways that support them healing instead of perpetuating further harm. So a way to think about this from Dr. Isaiah Pickens is that, being trauma informed, it's not an excuse, but explaining an explanation for them, for their behavior. So you're not blaming anyone, but you're trying to understand where they're coming from and how they're entering the space. One way that I've heard this phrase is thinking about asking someone what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. So this is an organizational framework. It's a way to think about how to be trauma informed that provides more of a therapeutic environment. It focuses on healing through relationships with the ways that you work with people and build up those connections. It focuses on strengths, resiliency, and wellness when you're thinking about being trauma informed. So instead of looking at people entering and pathologizing them, demonizing them, thinking about deficiencies that they bring, you're trying to maximize what they do well or what strengths they bring from what they've been through, and not focusing on what has been entirely negative, but placing it in a new context where it can actually help someone learn and grow. And it really comes from the inside out, not the outside in. All right, so Kimberly Crenshaw was the first person to use the word intersectionality, and it was within the context of feminism. She wrote about this in her paper, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination. The link will be available to that resource in the resources at the end of this presentation. So really this whole example of intersectionality comes from the law and from Kimberly Crenshaw. So at the time that she did this research in the late 80s, it was a time in the law where you could only, testify as being discriminated against as a Black person or as a woman, but not as a Black woman. Like you had to choose which basis of which you were being discriminated against. And what Kimberly Crenshaw really helped us understand and what she promoted through her essay, and so many changes have come from her breakthroughs in explaining this, that you can't really understand someone in that compartmentalized way, and different levels of ways that people are oppressed magnify and increase the ways that they're discriminated against. So intersectionality takes into account people's overlapping identities and experiences in order to understand the complexity of prejudices that they face. So intersectionality plays a role in how library users experience trauma, and also the frequency with which they may be exposed to traumatic events. So this intersectional wheel I really love, and it's adapted from Sylvia Duckworth's Wheel of Power and Privilege. And it shows at the nucleus, where power is centered and where most people tend to have power in our society. But the further out you go, you can see how the power differential changes depending on how the person identifies. So at the beginning of this presentation, I presented you with some aspects of my identity. And you can see where there are parts where I'm closer to the middle, right? Citizen, my income, Western, right? And then you can see how some of the other things that I mentioned, being Black, LGBTQ, non-European, like all of those kinds of things are more on the outside. So this can be a helpful way to explain that all of us have, ways that we are included, ways that we feel included, where we feel like we're centered in discourse, and ways when we are not. And again, intersectionality plays a role in how library users experience trauma and the frequency with which they experience traumatic events. So we're talking about public libraries, right, which have different levels of intersecting oppression. We have people from rural communities, right? And there are definitely ways that they are discriminated against and have more difficulty accessing resources and privilege. We have different concerns in public libraries too, with health disparities and also with literacy, financial literacy, digital literacy. These are things that are more difficult for them to access. So if we think about, those different intersections and how they will be placed under minority social stratification, that makes a difference in terms of how trauma impacts those people and how they will want to interact and use your library services and what they're bringing with them when they enter into those spaces. So again, with trauma in library work and with library users, there's a few things to keep in mind. One is that unaddressed trauma creates barriers to entry, right? Borrowing that term from economics and business for library services. So unaddressed trauma that has not been something that they've been able to talk about, process, learn through with someone else, that means it's still living in their bodies and it's impacting the way that they're entering the library space because no one's helped them with processing it. So a trauma-informed approach for library services will enhance access to the library and the services it provides by doing it in a trauma-informed way, a way that acknowledges that people have experienced harm and that sees them as a whole person and a whole family, depending on who it is when they enter into the library. And this also does reflect including a holistic viewpoint about the library workers and the people that make up the library as well to provide these services, because you're human too, and also have experiences that impact the way that you enter the library. This really focuses on emphasizing healing ourselves and the greater community when we think about trauma in library work with library users. And it allows people who have been harmed and injured to reach more of their full potential and to contribute to the world in meaningful ways when we approach library services in this way. All right, so that was a lot of information, but now we're going to get into an opportunity for all of you to talk to each other. So these are the prompts for your first group of breakout group discussion questions. What examples of trauma have you experienced in the workplace? This can be something that you've observed or something that you yourself have explained. And remember, for all of these breakout groups, only share what you feel comfortable sharing. You do not have to share anything that does not feel safe to share today. And then you want to think about, what was it like for you to experience that? What was it like for others? And you really want to do your best to think about what it may have been like for others, right? And demonstrate that empathy. You can't really know what it was like for everyone there unless they've told you. And even then, they might not have told you the whole story. But we want you to try to think about, from your perspective, what maybe they experienced. Okay, so the 3 questions again: what examples of trauma have you experienced in the workplace? What was it like for you? And what was it like for others? And we're going to put you into breakout groups, and you'll have, we're going to do 15 minutes of breakout groups instead of 20 for the time, but you'll have 15 minutes to talk about this together. Okay, so let me see. Can you help me with this, Christine? Or I could do it too, I think.
I think I've got them.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. So you can
You're
join
welcome.
Okay. All right, people are returning from breakout groups. Okay, so before we have a short break, I would love to hear if anyone would like to share something that they got from their breakout group, something that they learned, something that came up, really anything from that experience. We could take a couple minutes for that before your break. Anything you'd like to share with the group?
I don't want to put the other person on the spot, but we had someone else who I can't remember how she described herself, but like is generally from a place of privilege, but having other people approach her, how to describe this without telling her story. Anyways, even when you're in a place of privilege, if other people address you as saying like, well, you're not like these others, that's still really upsetting. That's as much as I can figure out how to say with.
No, that's great. No, I appreciate that, respecting the confidentiality. So you were saying like even being in a place of privilege, it makes it difficult to, like when you're still stereotyped or put into a same group, even if you're different from other people, it still doesn't feel good for someone to kind of throw you under the bus that way. Thank you, Claire. Would anyone else like to share something that they learned without, disclosing anything that you didn't discuss with someone previously, like Claire modeled for us?
You talked a little bit about how in your workplace, everybody's kind of trying to do the right thing, do the best they can, and then some kind of outside force, whether that's like administration or something like the bureaucracy of your environment, comes in and does something really disruptive. And you feel like even though you've said your part, you're not being listened to, you just don't have the power to change how they're approaching you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That's a great lead into the next part of my presentation. So I'm going to come back to that after our break. So everyone, you have 5 minutes. We'll come back at 3:06 for Eastern time, and I'll see you then, and then we'll wrap up this workshop. Thanks. All right, everyone, welcome back. I hope that you had a good short break to reset. We're going to keep going with some trauma-informed strategies and resources. So there are 6 trauma-informed principles that you want to keep in mind when working with others. The first is safety. The second is trustworthiness and transparency. The third is peer support. The fourth is collaboration and mutuality. The fifth is empowerment, voice, and choice. And the sixth is cultural, historical, and gender issues, which I mentioned earlier in this presentation with Kimberly Crenshaw. So I'll just give you a couple examples. One thing is with maximizing safety for the first principle is using the term community guidelines instead of policies when working with patrons. That can be more inclusive and help people feel more safe. Another example is with peer support. If you have some library patrons who speak Spanish, is there a way to connect them through like a library ambassador program or something like that, so they see other people like them, and that can increase their feelings of safety in the space. These 6 principles come from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So they define these on their website, and that was where I pulled this from. Okay, so trauma-informed strategies. There's some concepts that you want to keep in mind. The first are levels of engagement. The second, different positions, different perspectives. Third, good enough. Fourth, self-regulation. Fifth, communicating expectations. And the sixth is psychological and physical safety. So there are a couple of these that I really want to expand on. The first one is the very first one listed here, levels of engagement. So you want to clarify your individual level of engagement and your library's level of engagement with being trauma-informed. Being trauma-informed is a commitment and a practice, but you get to choose how far you want to go into it and how much you want to live those principles. There are larger issues here to consider regarding intersectionality, right, with gender, undervalued labor, race, ability, and that might impact your willingness, right, like your level of engagement. And the other thing to mention is that thinking about your level of engagement is very much informed by the time that we're in history. Many people have said that it feels like we're going through 3 pandemics right now: COVID, a racial reckoning, and then also climate change. And so with all of those things to keep in mind, we're dealing with overwhelm and burnout in a very difficult system. So the way that I think about it with being trauma informed is that, you know, it's like a building that needs renovation, but you still work in the building. So maybe there are some things that are still getting done around you, but you still have like your space and how you try to cultivate it to make it safe and make sure that you can do the things that you need to do in the building, even while the building's under repair. And so that's how I think about being trauma informed. There is trauma happening, but there are some things that we can do to mitigate the impact of trauma through some of these practices and concepts. There's different positions in your library, which means that people are going to have different perspectives about how much they're willing to be trauma informed and how much it requires of them. Someone who's in environmental services or groundskeeping might not need the same level of being trauma informed as a teen services librarian, right? And that's okay. But we do want to think about it as a full group and a community, because that's what makes up a library. You know, being good enough, you want to clarify, and this goes to the last one too, what your expectations are, right? What can your library offer? And then also, what are the expectations of your library users? So another example with this, as an analogy, are like treatment plans for a patient. There are some things that the doctor and medicine can help you with, but there's also patron accountability or patient accountability, right? Like there's some things that that person has to do to contribute to making the library what they want it to be. And so they need to also define their level of engagement. If they have a lot of complaints or things that they want to see in the library, everyone contributes to what the library is, right? Some other ideas here with expectations. Your team can create like a metric to decide what you can take on and what you can't as a team. And you can use some principles from project management with like risk assessment and different strategies from there that will be applicable to your particular context that you might want to use in terms of understanding what you might want to take on, what you can do and what you can't. Other micro strategies are referrals. So you want to make use of other organizations that can support when trauma happens. If you have a large unhoused population, what are the resources that are available nationally and locally that can give you support so that your library doesn't have to be the all things to all people? It can just focus on the things that it wants to do and instead refer people to other services that provide those same things. Checking in. So this is something that we did today with the raccoon meme, right? That includes even leaders checking in and even being vulnerable about how they're feeling. And that makes people feel more safe or feel more comfortable being safe. Positionality statements, self-care toolkits, and coping toolkits. There are opportunities to use those for when trauma occurs, whether it's, you know, international and something that's impacting people that come into the library, or it's something that happened locally. Are there things that you can pull on and use when trauma occurs? Other things are reflecting on, you know, when you feel most energized and what's most draining at work and in life. How can you maximize the things that give you energy, minimize the things that drain your energy? And then also group agreements like we did earlier today. Some other micro strategies are narration and setting expectations. So you might have noticed that I tried to do this throughout when I was like, yes, you are invited to breathe. You don't have to. Or you're invited to keep your camera on. You don't have to, right? Letting people know what they can do and narrating what's going to happen next. This is what we're going to do today. These are my expectations for working with you, right? I know I feel safer when people do that with me as well. Giving people time to process, ask questions, and reflect. So some of that thinking time with your definitions earlier today, that was intentional, even though it was quiet, to give you time to define trauma and to think about what you wanted to learn today in this presentation. Giving break times like we just did, really important, even online, to give people time to reset, take a bio break, and giving people options and choices, you know, even if it's limited options and choices, like when you know, are working with children, it's like you can do this or you could do that, you know, but still offering that does a lot for people with letting them know that they don't have to do exactly what you're saying, but can have some voice and choice in terms of what happens next within the parameters of what your library provides. All right, so those are some strategies. We're going to go into breakout groups one more time. We're going to change this to 10 minutes because we are starting to run low on time. But you will have the chance to talk about something personal. Again, when you experience a crisis, how do you prefer for people to support you? And describe examples of how you've seen others respond to supporting someone in crisis that you appreciated. Why did you appreciate their approach? So we're going to have 10 minutes to talk about this in groups, and then we'll come back for our last section of today. So Christine, I'm going to ask you to open the breakout groups. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Would love to hear some good things that came from that experience too. And actually we have about 50 seconds before everyone's back, but then I'll open it up to hear from folks. All right, thank you for participating in the breakout groups. I'd love to hear from folks. I've heard from one group already that they struggled to think of examples. So would love to hear if other folks are willing to share. Okay, I can tell you that one thing for me is that I really appreciate when people ask me what I need when something happens. So if they come to me and they're like, what would be helpful for you? And I'm like, oh, it'd be helpful if you picked up this package, or if you helped me with this errand. I really like when it's focused on me and not someone assuming what I need. That helps me a lot. Any other examples or things that you heard that you really liked or that you've seen other people model?
I've heard people ask, do you want to be heard or helped? Because sometimes people want action and sometimes they just want someone to listen to them.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Matthew. Sometimes someone's not looking for you to solve a problem or like get in there and fix things, which I tend to do when people tell me problems. But instead, like you said, it's just to be a listening ear or a support. So that's a great example. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I can tell you one thing I've seen as well with young people is also, again, like setting up different options for them to like play with or something like after they've gone through it. So they might have different options on a table and it's like, which one would you like to do? And then they're able to choose after they've been through something that's hard. And I found that, yeah, that younger folks really appreciate that. You can modify that, you know, depending on the situation, but I found that to be successful before. All right. So I think the takeaway from this one is to really ask people what they need and what they're looking for when it comes to patrons. The idea behind asking this question was to realize that sometimes we go through things as well, or, I mean, it doesn't have to be a full-blown crisis. It can just be when you're having a bad day, how you prefer for people to help you, and using that as a way to empathize with folks that you might work with in the library in order to better help them and support them with their needs. All right, so now we're at the last slide. You made it, congratulations. I'd like to hear your thoughts about what your takeaways are today. So we have a Padlet link that's in the chat. Wonderful, and I would love for you to fill that out with, yeah, what are your takeaways from today? So we'll take a few minutes for everyone to do that. All right, I see people are still working on their thoughts, which is great. I think so far we're talking about listening, patience and kindness and compassion, you know, and trying to use trauma-informed librarianship to build empathy, you know, to understand more about where your patrons are coming from and what they're going through. Yeah, so please continue to contribute to that. There are some resources that will be available that were linked throughout, or that I've mentioned throughout the presentation. And I just want to thank you all so much for attending today. That hour and a half flew by. So I really appreciate you meeting with me. I want to thank Christine and the SRCLC for having me. And yeah, thank you all of you for coming and participating. And here's my contact information if you'd like to be in touch. And I'm going to hand it back to Christine.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. And this was a great presentation. We thank you for doing this. And a reminder to everyone, part 2, focused on library workers, will be next Monday. If you haven't already, please feel free to sign up for that one as well. I am going to share a survey that we ask you to complete. And other than that, I think that's everything. We will send out the slides and the recording And I'll resend the link to register for next week in case you haven't already done that. Thank you.